Following the German conquest of Western Europe and the Luftwaffe's aerial war over England, the Third Reich turned its attention to the east. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, commenced on June 22, 1941. Germany's massive invasion force included 3 army groups thrusting toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev, each supported by their own air fleet. Over 2,500 combat-ready Luftwaffe aircraft were deployed across the invasion front. Crucially, the Luftwaffe's overall size had not increased from the previous year, meaning German pilots were exposed to another theatre of combat with more or less the same resources as they had in 1940. The new Bf-109F variant comprised the majority of more than 700 combat-ready single-engine fighter aircraft used for the initial assault, although the Bf-109E was also deployed in large numbers. Estimates for the number of Soviet aircraft facing the German forces vary. Some experts believe about 10,000 aircraft of all types, including reconnaissance and transport assets, were positioned in the western regions of the Soviet Union in 1941. Fighter aircraft accounted for just under 2/3 of Soviet air strength, but less than a quarter were modern designs, either the MiG-3, Yak-1, or Lag-3. The remainder were obsolete units, including the Polikarpov I-15 and I-16, easily outclassed by Luftwaffe fighters. On the first day of the invasion, an initial Luftwaffe assault of 637 bombers and 231 fighters struck Soviet airfields, causing extensive destruction and the loss of between 1,500 and 2,000 enemy aircraft either on the ground or in the air. Air combat was ultimately one-sided as the Soviet Union's poorly organized air defense collapsed. Soviet pilots' slow transition to new aircraft types and limited flying time seriously undermined their combat ability against the Luftwaffe. In the first few months of 1941, some Soviet pilots only received 5 to 15 hours of flight training in certain Western military districts. In addition, Soviet flying tactics were outdated, leaving Red Air Force fighters vulnerable to more experienced and battle-hardened German pilots. As a result, the Luftwaffe imposed staggering losses on the ground and in the air. Some estimates for destroyed Soviet aircraft across the summer of 1941 are about 7,500 to 8,000 air assets. It was a masterclass in the Luftwaffe's air strategy, and for a short period, the Soviet Air Force was knocked out of the war. However, the Luftwaffe still faced a depletion of aircraft and pilots as the Army's lightning advance into Soviet territory imposed serious operational and organizational strains on the service. German fighter losses between July and December 1941 came to 447 in combat and 378 from non-combat causes. However, the availability of serviceable aircraft was the Luftwaffe's real challenge. By October 1941, the ready rates of German air assets on the Eastern Front had absolutely tanked. Only 58% of single-engine fighters were in commission, while the number of twin-engine bombers was below 40%. The Battle of Moscow in the final 3 months of the year offers a window into the troubles facing the Luftwaffe at the time. The Soviet Air Force, which had recalled fighters and attack planes from Siberia, could deploy twice as many aircraft as the Luftwaffe. This meant that, at times and in short bursts, it gained brief air superiority over the battlefront. In the opening months of 1942, following a bitter winter and a stalling German offensive, the Luftwaffe's logistical and operational strains multiplied as the Soviets received a boost from higher production and an organizational overhaul of the Air Force. This gave Moscow some time to recover, and gradually, the Red Air Force started to contest the skies as new aircraft reinforced its ranks. As the year progressed, the strain on the Luftwaffe intensified as Allied activity on other fronts, including North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Western Europe, ramped up. It also coincided with the introduction of new Soviet aircraft, including the La-5 and Yak-9, in July and October 1942, respectively. The La-5, a significant development from the Lag-3, featured an air-cooled radial engine. The new aircraft could match the performance of Luftwaffe fighters at low altitudes, and by the end of that year, 1,129 units had been delivered. Meanwhile, the Yak-9 first saw action in the Battle of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-43. Its presence in the skies boosted Soviet pilots' ability to contend with Luftwaffe fighters on equal terms. Even so, 1942 marked another period of Luftwaffe air dominance. Estimated Soviet combat losses reached 7,800 aircraft over the year, while the Luftwaffe's total combat losses had reached just over 3,200 from January to October. Only 868 single-engine fighters were lost to enemy aircraft over this time. Luftwaffe pilots were simply superior to their Soviet counterparts, and their ability to maintain an edge over their opponents during this period shows just how sizable the skills gap was in air-to-air encounters. But the Luftwaffe was paying a heavy price to rule the skies. Throughout 1942, test pilots and instructors based in Germany were rounded up and deployed to the Eastern Front to meet the insatiable need for aircrew. By 1943, the Luftwaffe's technological and performance edge over the Soviet Air Force had ended, thanks to the widespread availability of new fighter designs, including the Yak-9. From this point on, the latest Bf-109G variants and later Fw-190A variants were more or less matched in the skies over the Soviet Union by their opponents. This meant that 1943 marked a turning point for the Luftwaffe, in which its technological advantages diminished and its ability to control the skies came to an end. Even so, German pilots remained a potent threat in air-to-air combat when deployed at scale, as seen in some of the Luftwaffe's last gasp attempts at offensive action. In several air-to-air engagements in the opening phases of Operation Citadel in 1943, German pilots destroyed hundreds of Soviet fighters and bombers, with only limited losses of their own. These massive encounters were considered the last operation of the so-called Old Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front, after which its ability to shape frontline developments was massively curtailed. No matter how many Soviet aircraft Luftwaffe fighters destroyed, the Red Air Force continued to produce vast numbers of planes and pilots at an astonishing rate. About 11,200 Soviet aircraft were lost in combat to the Luftwaffe alone in 1943, but 35,000 planes were manufactured over the same period. This advantage more than tipped the scales in Moscow's favor. The Luftwaffe was ultimately overwhelmed by its opponent's sheer size. During the latter months of 1943, the Soviets could deploy up to 10,000 aircraft across the entire front, while the Luftwaffe's total combat strength in the east, in December 1943, was just 1,668 aircraft. At the time, single-engine fighters accounted for only 27% of this total. As resources became increasingly strained and the number of experienced pilots diminished, the Luftwaffe's air fleets in the east were a lower priority in the hierarchy of Germany's aerial warfare needs. This is because the skies in the west became the Third Reich's primary concern, as US and British pressure escalated. The Luftwaffe's changing priorities can also be seen in the difference in armament used by fighters on the eastern and western fronts. Only 17% of the Luftwaffe's total supply of 13mm and 20mm aircraft guns were located on the Eastern Front by the middle of 1943. The majority of these weapons were used by fighters in the West to deal with Allied heavy bombers, as the Luftwaffe developed heavily armed sub-variants of the Bf-109 and Fw-190. This situation left Luftwaffe pilots completely underarmed when facing heavily armored Soviet aircraft like the IL-2, which accounted for about 30% of total Red Air Force strength. The vast expanse of the Eastern Front ultimately swallowed up the relatively small Luftwaffe. By January 1944, German pilots were facing off against nearly 14,000 Soviet aircraft. In contrast, the Luftwaffe's authorized frontline fighter strength across all fronts was just over 2,200 aircraft, of which only 1,095 were operationally ready at the end of 1943. From then on, German air power in the east diminished to a scattered defensive force, incapable of shaping the strategic picture across the front. The Luftwaffe's experience on the Eastern Front showed that pilot skill, tactical finesse, and technological edge were insufficient against an adversary with a massive advantage in manpower and aircraft. But in the end, Luftwaffe losses in the east were overshadowed by events taking place in the Mediterranean and Western Europe, where German pilots were coming up against a combined American and British air offensive.